Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about Vince Russo's massive ego and how it led to the downfall of WCW. Now, let's get it right out of the way. I'm not saying Vince Russo killed WCW. He certainly is one of the people who stuck a knife in the still living body of WCW and let it bleed. But for the third time, and for the probably 150,000th time, it was the merger and the executives at Warner Brothers and AOL that killed WCW. But Vince Russo certainly did not help. And if you watch this documentary, if you've watched previous documentaries, if you listen to other shoot interviews, you'll know that Vince Russo, his ego has made him absolutely invincible to any type of criticism for the things that he did while he was in WCW. Now, the big thing that has taken over the internet is that Vince Russo was talking about how he was better than 80% of the talent on WCW's roster. That has taken over the internet. But that quote is just one, pinpoint of Vince Russo's massive ego that explains a lot of why he fails. But because he has this sort of cult of personality, nothing is ever his fault. People still believe that he had good ideas. People still believe he was able to do things in WWE because he had no filter and nobody was telling him what to do and all this kind of stuff. And all of this is false. I mean, even if you take into account that he did a great job in WWF, bringing fresh ideas to a stagnant company, which nobody can deny and nobody has ever denied. But what has been under debate is that Vince Russo, along with Ed Ferrara, had to go through Vince McMahon before any of their kooky ideas made television. Vince Russo has repeatedly said there was no buffer, there was nothing like that. But even in his book, he said if we wanted to do something that was a little outside of the box, we had Vince McMahon contact Bonnie Hammer, who ran USA, and he would get the okay from her before they did it. So there was at least two people that were going through what they were writing before it went to television. So the idea that there is no buffer is a lie. Vince Russo is a liar, okay? So the idea is Vince Russo came to WCW because he was upset that Vince McMahon did not care about him and his family. Told Vince McMahon, hey, he was starting up SmackDown. Him and Ed Ferrara wanted to write SmackDown, or he wanted Ed Ferrara and Vince Russo to write SmackDown, and he wasn't offering any more money, and it was going to take more time away from the family. And Vince Russo wanted to know if Vince cared. And the famous line is that, hey, hire a nanny. That was essentially the response Vince McMahon gave to Vince Russo. Russo was so offended by this that he quit his job at the WWF and went and joined WCW. But in reality, he signed because WCW offered him $1 million. Now, I'm sure Vince McMahon, being a dickhead about family, didn't help matters. But it is never mentioned that Vince Russo was offered $1 million by WCW to jump ship. And then he did. The whole thing with the nanny was just an excuse to babyface himself. But you shouldn't need to do that because everybody understands you're a writer and you were offered $1 million. That's fine. That's a lot of money for a writer, especially a TV writer. That's a lot of money. You could just say, hey, they offered me $1 million. Of course I left. Vince McMahon wasn't going to give me $1 million, but instead it had to be he didn't care about me and my family. Again, he's a liar. He was offered $1 million by WCW because Bill Bush, who hired him, was convinced that he was the genius behind all of the WWF programming, and he was made head of creative for WCW. Now, 3 months into that, and now Vince Russo is starting to change his story just a little bit. First, he, really touted and trumpeted how ratings went up when he became the head writer for the first 3 months. Now he's starting to say it went up slightly because now people are starting to dig into the data and they know that it wasn't as huge a success as he was making it out to be. But technically he is still correct that the ratings went up the first 3 months he was there. But he was so good at his job that they tried to replace him 3 months in. Now, I'm doing this on the top of my head. I'm not sure if it's a 2-year deal he had with WCW or a 3-year deal. I'm pretty sure it was a 2-year deal. So he was replaced, and they tried to put him in the booking committee 3 months into his program. Now, here's why that occurred. Vince Russo, throughout the entirety, I'll have to go throughout the entirety of his run, ratings went up a little bit, but mostly attendance went down, pay-per-view buys went down. Vince Russo is not a team player, okay? So he was offered a spot to be on the booking committee, and he said no. Now, the reason he said no is because he claims that he agreed to be the head writer, not to be a part of a committee, despite the fact that him writing with Ed Ferrara is kind of like a committee. It's kind of a partnership. There's a bunch of people, there's at least 2 people involved. He's not writing the show singularly by himself. So, he, of course, throughout the writing of his product, started having all kinds of problems. I'm surprised this word didn't come up more, which is standards and practices. He blames standards and practices for pretty much everything. And that is true. Standards and practices was a big problem with the success of WCW. This is part of why the executives were smothering the company to death. But Vince Russo had such a huge ego that he could not take modifying his ideas to better fit standards and practices. He could not understand that other people and other things mattered rather than writing the show. Throughout his book, what is it called? Rope Opera, how WCW nearly killed Vince Russo, which is, of course, centering himself as the most important thing, right? WCW almost killed me. I didn't almost kill it. He admits in the book, and he also admits in Nitro, and he also admits in this documentary, he didn't give a damn about anything other than writing a wrestling show. Imagine that you hired a quarterback or a wide receiver who tell you, well, my job is to catch the ball, or my job is to throw the ball or hand the ball off. I'm not doing no blocking. That's not my job. And it's like, wait a minute, but that is part of your job. We hired you to do like all of these things. If we require for you to, have a block for another receiver or to have a block for the running back, then that's what you're supposed to do. That's part of being a part of the team. Vince Russo didn't think about it that way. If his writing hampered the pay-per-views, hampered attendance, offended advertisers, he didn't care and his thing is, I was hired to write a show. It's like, but the show needs to make money. Where do you think the money comes from for television shows? He is so shallow and so focused on himself that he could not even see that if you devastate the advertising base, the show's ratings are irrelevant, which everybody should have known, and which he would have known had he been paying attention. If he was such a genius, he would have figured that out himself. But he didn't. This is why WCW kept doing things like putting him in a booking committee, putting Eric Bischoff there with him to hold his hand. And I'm not saying Eric Bischoff is a great guy either, because we know that they together came up with that foolishness with David Arquette. But that's neither here nor there. Vince Russo could not adapt. He could only do things his way. But you can't do your things your way without thinking about other people and then expect success. And then here's another thing that I really I say this, I think last time I criticized Vince Russo when it comes to WCW, I think I did it on the live stream when we were watching a WCW pay-per-view. Vince Russo did nothing but essentially recreate what worked in the WWF in WCW. So, he had the Canadian hero, Bret Hart. He tried to recreate that with Lance Storm. Had a hardcore division in WWF. Bring the hardcore division to WCW. He had some success with the overbearing, let's say, boss of the show. That became a running Vince Russo trip. He went to WCW, put himself on screen as the head writer, of course, destroying the fourth wall, which is what people are interested in when it comes to stories. Yeah, Deadpool can do it. Certain comic book characters can get away with breaking the fourth wall. But when you're talking about the writers and the script on a wrestling show, you have absolutely destroyed the people's ability to invest in the storyline. And he was doing this. He made himself the authority figure in both TNA and WCW because Mr. McMahon worked, so it'll work somewhere else too. And this, of course, is what leads him to writing himself as an on-screen television character. Now, of course, all of this is based off of Eric Bischoff also being a on-screen character. So it seems to be a thing. Well, Bill Watts also did it, where guys who run the show typically write themselves into the show as an on-screen authority figure. So it's not like Vince Russo was, the only one to do that, but he's a writer. Bill Watts was a wrestler. Vern Gagne was a wrestler. Eric Bischoff was not a wrestler. Vince McMahon was not a wrestler, and Vince Russo was not a wrestler. But if you take, Vince Russo is not the character or the personality that Vince McMahon is. He is not as smarmy and underhanded as Eric Bischoff is. He is loud and brash, and no, people didn't like him. So did he work as a heel? I guess, but he didn't have the characteristics of everybody else. So before we even start talking about the idea that him being better than 80% of the roster, which everybody knows is garbage, as soon as you hear it, even 80% of the, better than them at what, by the way? But again, we'll get there. We just want to tell the story of Vince Russo's massive ego. So he was basically copying his own homework from the WWF. He would do that again in TNA, where he would just take certain things that worked in the WWF and bring them to TNA, because having a second idea or a third idea just doesn't seem to make sense for him. Now, Vince Russo was obsessed with everything being real. Everything had to be real, even though wrestling is not real, but it could be based on real things. The Vince McMahon heel turn, based on something that was somewhat real. Well, correction, it was based on something real. But it didn't break the fourth wall. It wasn't unbelievable. It wasn't believable that a guy would stand in the middle of the ring and talk about being the writer and going against the script and all this kind of stuff that Vince Russo was doing with like Goldberg and people like this. It was ridiculous. Now, as if you've been listening, you understand that despite the fact that I called Vince Russo a liar, there were certain things that were absolutely true, and I mentioned those things. Another thing that was actually true that mentioned in this documentary is that Vince Russo was a favorite, like the mid-card guys, the Benoits, the Saturns, the Eddie Guerreros, etc. Now, here's the thing. As usual, it's true, but with a caveat. These guys did prefer Vince Russo, but they preferred Vince Russo to Kevin Sullivan, who took over when Vince Russo was when he went home. So it wasn't that they loved Vince Russo because they thought he had great ideas. It was they liked Vince Russo because he thought differently. Again, this was one of the things that Booker T talked about when he gave Vince Russo a ton of credit for making him world champion. Booker T talked about the established thinking of WCW being the good old boys club in his perspective. From, I'm not sure they're ready for a black champion, even though they already had one. But, WCW still had a reputation for being a racist company. But Vince Russo was an outsider. He was a guy who came from the WWF, from New York, and was writing a Southern wrestling promotion. And in doing so, he changed people's thinking. He wanted to actually try to make new stars, get more people involved with the show. These things are positives. And Kevin Sullivan had a more traditional view of pro wrestling. You push the stars should go over. The guys at the top had too much power, too much clout. They could kill these guys, crush these guys, not want to work with these guys. Same thing happened with Chris Jericho before he left. He wanted to get into a pay-per-view match with Goldberg. It wouldn't happen. Goldberg didn't like what he was doing. Jericho got frustrated, pretty much left. Same thing happened with Benoit, Malenko, Saturn. And somebody who is willing to give them an opportunity is Vince Russo. So that's a huge positive in his camp because you say, at the very least, Vince Russo was willing to give other people opportunities. But then you realize being open-minded to the point where your brain falls out because, oh, I'm going to make David Arquette the world champion, and I'm going to make myself the world champion because I'm a huge star too, if you hadn't noticed. And again, Vince Russo was so selfish. It wasn't just that he was selfish in making himself the world champion. It was that he was selfish in thinking, I can go out there and get the ratings myself. Nobody else is going to draw ratings here. I'm going to go get the ratings myself. It's like, he's talking like he's going out and harvesting berries or something like that. Nobody came to see you, Otis. Nobody came to see this guy. Nobody's paying to see Vince Russo. Why are you here? Why are you the world champion of all people? He swears up and down in the documentary that Goldberg was trying to hurt him. But the interesting bit is that Goldberg, we had already established in this documentary and in others, is heavy-handed. He doesn't know how to pull his punches. He's green. So the idea that he was trying to actively hurt Vince Russo, because Vince Russo was paranoid, and oh, they were trying to hurt me, they were trying to kill me. You were writing yourself into the show. You were writing yourself into these beatings. You didn't have to take them. Nobody asked you to do this. You did it yourself. Goldberg was trying to hurt me. For starters, brother, you were wearing football pads, and you were wearing a helmet, and you knew Goldberg's reputation for being stiff. How could you not know? Nash is there, Hogan's there, Hall is there. Everybody can tell you. Bret Hart is there. Everybody can tell you that Goldberg is tough to deal with. And you put yourself in the line of fire. It's not that Goldberg was trying to kill you. It's that Goldberg is gigantic and green, and he did what gigantic green dudes do, which is hit too hard. But the bottom line of it all is the true measure of being talented in pro wrestling is whether people are willing to pay to see you or if people remember the things that you were doing. Out of all of the stuff that Vince Russo did on television, the only thing people really remember from his time on television was the Bash at the Beach. That was pretty much it. He was on TV for weeks and weeks and weeks, and Bash at the Beach is the most memorable thing he did. He made himself the world champion, and Bash at the Beach is still the most memorable thing he's ever done. How could you gauge to say, well, he's more talented? It's like, at what? He's not a good wrestler. He's not great at talking. He doesn't have some kind of tremendous charisma. This was a guy who was on WWF television as Vic Venom. So he had experience being on TV. He had experience being a character, and he couldn't even do that right. This guy has a massive ego for no reason. I'm not going to rant and rave about Vince Russo for too much longer. I will just say this. Vince Russo was a lot like Kevin Nash. Did he add things to WCW that were beneficial to the company? Absolutely. Did he really give a fuck about the company? No, he did not. Did he care mostly about himself and what he was doing? Yes. Did he pay attention to how this benefited or harmed anyone else? No, because if he had, he wouldn't have done half the stuff that he was doing. Why would the new blood pour blood on people? See, they were doing that in WWF with the Brood because they were vampires, right? Why would the new blood pour blood on people? Why would you do that? Even the idea of the Millionaires Club and the new blood, I actually don't hate that idea. I think it's actually sensible for a to do a company-wide reboot where we're stripping all the titles and doing all over again. Probably not. But the idea that the young guys would group together and go after, the more established talents, well, they did that with the Nexus, right? So these ideas can be, can be redone again, and they have a germ of a good idea attached to it. But ultimately, what is the reasoning behind them pouring blood on these people? And the idea that you could just make a star out of anybody, without gauging talent, without gauging charisma. Oh, I'm going to make a star out of Buff Bagwell and his mom. I'm going to make a star out of Ernest the Cat Miller. I'm going to plaster him all over television. All these things are really bad ideas. What was this? Hacksaw Jim Duggan as, being forced to be Canadian. You know, it's just a bunch of stupid shit that he was doing. And everybody talks about the stupid things that he did. He's not going to get away with anything stupid. The issue here is that he has a massive ego, even to this day. He doesn't take any accountability for anything that happened. None of them do. Brad Siegel doesn't. Bischoff doesn't. But at least those guys are willing to take on the chin that they didn't stop it. That they, you know, made a mistake in letting some of these things run wild. Eric, you have Vince Russo, for God's sake, is acting like, well, you just didn't see the big picture. My ideas were heavily edited and all this kind of stuff. It's like, no, even if you had gotten a chance to do it the way that you wanted to do it, it was still not going to work out because it was stupid or it was derivative. It was just another version of something else going on. Even his TNA work was derivative. We're going to fight for control of the company. Everything is about having control of the company. And, you know, it's like, come on, hardcore divisions and all this kind of shit. It's like, come on, bro. Like, none of this stuff matters. These guys tried their best. Vince Russo probably had his heart in the right place, but his ego does not match his talent. And this is one of the reasons why Vince Russo has failed everywhere he's gone, except the WWF. But have him tell it, have all his sycophants tell it. He's a great genius who saved the WWF while they was losing the wrestling war, and all hail Vince Russo. But actually watch these shows before you start saying stuff like that. All right, like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.
Old non-aggression. Once that lesson sets in, you'll see a session where you got an affection for no progression, regression.